The mask felt cold in Jason's hands, its weight both familiar and oppressive. He ran his thumb over its smooth, worn surface, tracing the ancient carvings etched into the bone-white material. The mask was a relic, passed down through generations of his family, imbued with an arcane power that only those of his bloodline could wield. It had no mouth, only two hollow eye slits that stared back at him with an eerie emptiness. He had worn it countless times, yet the sight of it still sent a chill crawling up his spine. Jason stood in his modest home, a small cabin tucked away at the edge of town, far enough from the noise and bustle of daily life. His work required solitude, and over the years he had embraced the isolation that came with his duty. Demon slayers like him were rare, and the townsfolk had long forgotten the true nature of the threats that lurked in the shadows. To them, Jason was simply a quiet man, withdrawn but reliable. They didn't know that the mask gave him the ability to see the demons hiding in plain sight. He placed the mask on his face, the familiar weight settling over him like an old friend. The room around him shifted, its colors dulling, shadows deepening. The world as he knew it fell away, replaced by something colder, darker. Through the mask, Jason saw the world as it truly was, the place where human and demon realms overlapped. The demons, once hidden behind the facade of human flesh, were now clear to him. They moved among people, unseen and unsuspected, their twisted forms barely concealed beneath human faces. Tonight, like so many nights before, he would hunt. Jason stepped out into the cool night air. The town spread out before him like a forgotten relic. Cobblestone streets wound between old wooden houses, the faint glow of lanterns casting flickering light across empty roads. The town was quiet now, but Jason knew better than to trust the stillness. The demons didn't rest, and neither could he. As he moved through the streets, his senses heightened. Every noise, every flicker of movement caught his attention. His eyes, sharpened by the mask's power, scanned each dark corner and alley, searching for the telltale signs of demonic presence. It wasn't long before he found his first target. A figure stood at the edge of a dimly lit street, half hidden in shadow. To any ordinary person, it would have appeared as just another townsperson, perhaps heading home after a long day. But through the mask, Jason saw the truth. Its skin was cracked and pale, black veins spiderwebbing beneath the surface. Its eyes glowed faintly, the pupils slitted like a serpent's. This was no human. The demon didn't see him approach. Jason was quick, silent, a shadow moving through shadows. In one swift motion, he unsheathed his blade, the silver edge gleaming in the darkness. He struck with precision, the blade slicing through flesh and bone as easily as if it were cutting air. The demon barely had time to let out a gurgling gasp before it crumpled to the ground, its human disguise unraveling as it died. Jason stared at the creature's lifeless form for a moment, watching as it dissolved into the night, leaving only a faint wisp of smoke in its place. Another one gone, another small victory in a war that seemed endless. The mask had been his constant companion in this battle, guiding him, showing him what others could not see. For years, it had revealed the truth to him, helping him rid the town of the demons that infested it. Each time he killed one, the town became just a little bit safer. But the work was never done. The demons always came back. As he continued through the town, his mind wandered to the history of the mask. His father had worn it before him, and his grandfather before that. Each generation of his family had been demon slayers, sworn to protect the town from the dark forces that lurked at its edges. The mask was more than just a tool. It was a legacy, a burden that Jason carried with him every day. It had kept him alive even as it slowly eroded his connection to the world around him. He had long ago accepted that the mask came at a price. It isolated him from those he protected, making him an outsider in his own community. The mask showed him the truth, but it also distanced him from it. How could he relate to the people of the town when he saw their world through the lens of demons and blood? He had saved them time and again, yet they could never understand the danger they were in, nor could they understand the toll it took on him. As Jason made his way through the town, he spotted another demon, this one lingering near the market square. It was hunched over, its grotesque body twisted and deformed, barely maintaining its human guise. He approached it quietly, his grip tightening on his blade. Another quick strike, another clean kill. But as he stood over the dissolving remains, a strange thought crossed his mind. The demons had been coming more frequently lately, their numbers growing. Was it possible that something had changed? Was there a greater force behind their resurgence? Something darker? Something older? Jason shook the thought away. He couldn't afford to dwell on possibilities. His duty was clear: hunt the demons, protect the town. That was all that mattered. But as the night wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, something just out of sight. He glanced around, the mask's hollow eyes scanning the darkness. For a moment he thought he saw movement, a shadow darting across the rooftops. But when he looked again, there was nothing. He had grown accustomed to the sensation of being watched. After all, demons were always lurking, always waiting. But tonight it felt different. There was an unsettling presence, a weight in the air that he couldn't explain. Jason continued his patrol, pushing the feeling aside. He couldn't afford distractions. The town depended on him, even if they didn't know it. As long as he wore the mask, he could protect them. But deep down, in the farthest recesses of his mind, a doubt began to grow. How long could he keep this up? How long before the mask's power consumed him completely, turning him into something unrecognizable? For now, Jason kept moving, his blade ready, his mask firmly in place. But as he hunted through the night, a question lingered at the edges of his thoughts. What if the greatest threat wasn't the demons he hunted, but the mask itself? The night air had never felt so thick, clinging to Jason's skin like a layer of cold sweat. The streets of the town seemed emptier than usual, quieter, as though the world had taken a collective breath and was waiting for something terrible to happen. Jason felt it in his bones, a wrongness in the air, a tension that made his heart pound and his instincts sharpen. He had spent years hunting demons in these streets, but tonight felt different. He moved swiftly through the town, his boots barely making a sound against the cobblestones. The mask clung to his face, its cold weight pressing against his skin. Through its eye slits, the familiar view of the world appeared warped and dim, as though everything was seen through a veil of shadow. But with the mask on, Jason could see what others could not. He could see the demons, their human disguises unraveling under the scrutiny of the mask's ancient power. He had been tracking this particular demon for weeks. It was cunning, more so than the others, and it had managed to evade him at every turn. But not tonight. Jason could feel its presence now, a subtle shift in the air that sent a shiver down his spine. He followed the sensation, weaving through narrow alleys and darkened streets, until he found himself standing before an old, abandoned church on the outskirts of town. The building loomed before him, its windows dark and hollow, its wooden doors rotting and splintered. It hadn't been used in years, not since the town's population had dwindled and the church had fallen into disrepair. But Jason knew better than to trust the quiet. He could feel the demon inside, a festering malignancy that pulsed like a heartbeat. He tightened his grip on his blade and pushed open the doors. The hinges groaned in protest, the sound echoing through the empty halls. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The faint smell of something rotting lingered in the corners, mixing with the cold, damp scent of neglect. The moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. And then he saw it. The demon stood at the far end of the church, near the altar. Its back was turned to him, but even from this distance, Jason could see the unnatural way its body shifted and twitched. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs too long, its posture grotesque. It wore a human shape, but only just. The mask allowed Jason to see past the illusion, revealing the thing's true form: jagged, twisted bones jutting from its flesh, skin that shimmered with an oily black sheen, and a head that was more skull than face, with eyes like burning coals set deep into the sockets. Jason stepped forward, the sound of his boots muffled by the dust-covered floor. The demon didn't move. It didn't seem to care that he was there. It just stood there, staring up at the altar, as though something unseen held its attention. But Jason wasn't fooled. This creature was no mindless beast. It had been evading him for too long, playing games with him, and he wasn't about to let it slip away again. In one swift motion, Jason raised his blade and moved toward it. The demon didn't react at first, and for a brief moment, Jason thought he'd caught it off guard. But just as the blade came down, the demon spun around with inhuman speed, its hand shooting up to block the strike. Jason's sword clashed against the demon's clawed fingers, sending a shock of force up his arm. Up close, the creature was even more grotesque than he'd imagined. Its mouth was a jagged, toothy maw, twisted into a grotesque smile. It hissed, a low, guttural sound that reverberated through the air. Jason gritted his teeth and pushed harder, but the demon held firm, its strength far greater than any he had faced before. "You've been hunting me, Slayer," the demon said, its voice a rasping growl that sent a shiver down Jason's spine. "But you're not the hunter tonight." Jason felt a chill run through him as the demon's eyes met his. They were too deep, too dark, as though they held something ancient and malevolent. The air around them seemed to thicken, the temperature dropping as a strange pressure built up in the room. Without warning, the demon let go of Jason's blade and lashed out with its other hand. Jason barely had time to react as the claws raked across his chest, sending him stumbling back. Blood seeped from the wound, but Jason didn't falter. He surged forward again, his blade slicing through the air toward the demon's neck. This time, he struck true. The demon's head snapped back, black blood spraying from the gash. It let out a strangled, gurgling scream and staggered backward. Jason didn't let up, slashing again and again until the creature collapsed to its knees, its body convulsing in a pool of its own dark ichor. Jason stood over it, breathing heavily, his chest heaving with exertion. But as he raised his blade for the final blow, the demon let out a soft, mocking laugh. "You think you've won, Slayer?" it rasped, blood bubbling at the corners of its mouth. "You think you can end this with a blade? You know nothing of what's coming." Jason's grip tightened on his sword. He'd heard the demons speak in riddles before, always trying to sow doubt, to unnerve him in their final moments. But there was something different about this one, something colder. Before Jason could strike, the demon's hand shot out with startling speed, wrapping its bony fingers around the edge of Jason's mask. Its touch was icy, burning cold, and Jason felt a surge of dark energy pass through the mask into his mind. The demon's eyes gleamed with a sickening light as it whispered words in a language Jason didn't understand. A curse. Jason could feel it, crawling beneath his skin, twisting through his thoughts like a serpent. The mask, once a tool that had guided him for so long, now pulsed with the demon's malevolent energy. "You see the world through that mask, don't you?" the demon hissed, its voice barely more than a whisper. "But now, it will show you something more, something far worse." Jason tore the mask from his face, but it was too late. The curse had already taken hold. The demon let out one final, rattling breath and collapsed, its body disintegrating into ash before Jason's eyes. But even as the creature faded, its voice lingered in the air, echoing in Jason's mind. "You will see your future, Slayer, and it is darker than you can imagine." Jason stood in the empty church, his breathing ragged, his hands trembling as he looked down at the mask in his hands. Something had changed. He could feel it, deep inside, a weight pressing against his mind, a coldness that hadn't been there before. The mask, once a source of power, now felt like a burden, heavy and ominous. He could still feel the demon's curse lingering in the air, clinging to the mask like a dark stain. And in the back of his mind, a creeping sense of dread took root. For the first time in years, Jason felt fear. Jason's hands trembled as he lowered the mask onto his face, the familiar weight settling over him like a leaden shroud. It felt heavier now, as though the demon's curse had seeped into its very essence, warping it into something more sinister. For years, it had been his greatest weapon, his link to the hidden world of demons, a tool to protect his town from unseen horrors. But now it was something else entirely. The visions had started almost immediately after the encounter in the church. At first, they came in brief flashes, blood, violence, death, blinking in and out of his mind like fleeting nightmares. But as the days wore on, they grew longer, more vivid. He could no longer dismiss them as mere hallucinations. Each time he put the mask on, the images sharpened, like jagged shards of glass slicing into his consciousness. Tonight, the vision hit him as soon as the mask's cold edge touched his skin. He was standing in the middle of town, surrounded by familiar faces. People he had known for years, friends, neighbors, even children, were gathered around him, looking up at him with wide, terrified eyes. His hands were drenched in blood, his blade dripping with the remains of those he had just slaughtered. He looked down at the bodies at his feet and saw the faces of the dead staring back at him, their lifeless eyes frozen in expressions of shock and betrayal. He saw himself move, felt his body surge forward, driven by an unstoppable force. He watched, helpless, as his blade sliced through flesh and bone with a ferocity that sent blood spraying into the air. The screams echoed in his ears, their terror a twisted chorus that seemed to stretch on forever. And then he saw it, his own reflection, standing over the carnage, wearing the same mask, his eyes burning with madness. Jason ripped the mask from his face, gasping for breath. The vision was gone, the town square silent and empty around him. His heart pounded in his chest, his pulse hammering in his ears. He clenched his hands into fists, trying to shake the image from his mind, but it clung to him like a living thing, its talons sinking deep into his thoughts. The mask wasn't showing him illusions anymore. It was showing him the future, his future. For the first time in his life, Jason was no longer sure who the enemy was. He had hunted demons for so long, trusting the mask to reveal their true forms, to guide him in his mission. But now he couldn't shake the feeling that the real danger lay somewhere else, within himself. The curse had twisted the mask, warping its power into something darker, something that fed on his fear and uncertainty. He couldn't trust it anymore. But even without the mask, the visions lingered at the edges of his mind, waiting for a moment of weakness to flood his thoughts with the same nightmarish images. Jason hadn't slept in days. Every time he closed his eyes, the visions returned, haunting him with scenes of bloodshed and violence. The lines between the real world and the nightmarish future he saw in the mask had begun to blur. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced that he had already committed the atrocities he'd seen. It was only when he stumbled out of bed and found the town still standing, its people still alive, that he realized it had only been a dream. But how much longer would that last? As the days passed, Jason's paranoia grew. The faces in the visions were becoming clearer and worse. They were the faces of people he knew, people he trusted. He began to see the flickers of deception in their eyes, the subtle changes in their expressions that told him they were hiding something. Demons had always been able to blend in, to wear human faces, but now even the most familiar faces seemed alien to him. He avoided his friends, his fellow hunters, even the few townsfolk he still spoke to. Every conversation felt like a trap, every glance like a hidden threat. He found himself watching them, waiting for a sign a slip in their disguise that would reveal their true nature. The mask had shown him the future. They would all turn on him eventually. It was only a matter of time. The first kill came sooner than expected. It was a cold, moonless night, the town swallowed by darkness. Jason had been restless, the weight of the mask heavy in his hands, calling to him. He'd fought the urge to put it on, knowing the visions would follow, but the pull was too strong. When he finally donned the mask, the world shifted, and there, standing just outside his door, was a figure he recognized immediately. Marcus, a fellow hunter and one of Jason's closest allies. Through the mask, Marcus's face shimmered with a dark energy, his eyes glinting with something inhuman. Jason's heart raced as he saw the demon beneath the surface, the thing that had been hiding in plain sight for so long. The mask had warned him. It had shown him the truth. Jason didn't hesitate. The blade came down fast, swift and deadly, cutting through Marcus's flesh before he could even scream. The sound of steel slicing through bone filled the air, and in the pale light of the lanterns, Jason watched as Marcus crumpled to the ground, lifeless. His eyes, wide with shock, stared up at Jason, empty and human. Jason stood over the body, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his mind racing. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Marcus had been a demon. He had seen it. But as he knelt beside the body, as his fingers touched the cooling skin of his fallen friend, doubt began to creep in. There was no sign of demonic influence, no hint of the monstrous form the mask had revealed. Just Marcus. Jason backed away, his bloodied hands trembling. The mask still sat on his face, its hollow eyes staring into the night. He had been so sure, so convinced that the vision had shown him the truth. But now, as he looked down at Marcus's body, all he could see was the terrible reality of what he had done. Panic gripped him as the pieces began to fall into place. The visions weren't warnings. They weren't showing him hidden demons. They were pushing him, guiding him down a path of violence and destruction. The mask wasn't revealing the truth. It was twisting it, feeding him a distorted version of reality. But it was too late. The seed had already been planted. The killings became more frequent after that. Jason could no longer trust anyone. Friends, neighbors, even strangers on the street. All of them became potential threats in his mind. The visions drove him to act, to strike before the demons could strike first. Each time he donned the mask, it showed him the same horrific scenes: blood, death, betrayal. And each time, Jason became more convinced that he had to act, that he had to kill. The town had grown quieter, emptier. People began to avoid him, their eyes filled with fear whenever they saw him approach. They whispered about him behind closed doors, but Jason heard the rumors. They were calling him mad, saying he had lost control. But Jason knew the truth. The mask had shown him everything. He was protecting them, saving them from a fate worse than death. At least that's what he told himself. But as the bodies piled up, as the blood stained his hands and the whispers grew louder, Jason couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The mask had once been his ally, but now it felt like a curse, a constant presence in his mind, pushing him toward darker and darker thoughts. He no longer recognized the man staring back at him in the mirror, his eyes hollow and haunted. The descent had begun, and Jason was powerless to stop it. The snow fell softly, blanketing the ground in a suffocating silence. Jason stood alone in the center of the town square, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The town was dead, its streets empty, its windows dark. Only the dull amber glow of the lanterns lit the night, casting long, twisted shadows across the ground. Shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. His hands shook as he gripped the mask, its familiar weight now feeling foreign in his grasp. He had worn it so many times, trusting in its power, believing it was his only weapon against the horrors that plagued this town. But tonight, As the wind howled through the empty streets, the mask felt like something else, something darker, something that had been lying to him all along. He hesitated, his thumb tracing the edge of the mask's cold surface. It whispered to him, the same insidious voice that had haunted him for weeks now, promising clarity, promising salvation. But Jason knew better. He could feel the truth hovering at the edge of his mind, just out of reach, waiting for him to take one last step. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a reminder of the horrors he had unleashed. The blood, the bodies, the friends he had slaughtered. The truth. It had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. With trembling hands, Jason raised the mask to his face. The world shifted. The cold, moonlit night twisted into something darker, something more sinister. The mask's vision came to life, showing him the familiar nightmare that had played out so many times before. He saw the town square filled with bodies, friends, neighbors, children, all lying in a mangled heap at his feet. Their eyes, wide with terror, stared up at him, accusing, unblinking. And there he stood, at the center of it all, his blade dripping with blood, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His face, once hidden by the mask, was now visible in the reflection of a nearby shop window. He didn't recognize the man staring back at him. His eyes were wild, burning with madness, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. The same smile he had seen on the demon's face that fateful night. The vision blurred, the edges of reality warping as something new crept into his mind. For the first time, Jason saw beyond the violence, beyond the bloodshed. He saw the truth. It wasn't the town that had been corrupted. It was him. The mask hadn't shown him the future. It had shown him his descent, moment by moment, into madness. The demon's curse hadn't been a warning about others. It had been a slow, methodical unraveling of his mind, twisting his perception until he could no longer distinguish friend from foe. The demons he had been hunting were never real. The mask had used his fear, his doubt, and his isolation against him, turning him into the very monster he had spent his life fighting. The bodies, the innocent people he had slain, flashed through his mind, each face clearer than ever. Marcus, Lydia, old Tom from the inn, and little Emily, her tiny body lying limp in the snow. They had all trusted him. They had all believed in him, and he had butchered them in cold blood, convinced that the mask was revealing their hidden demonic nature. A sob escaped his throat, the weight of the realization crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His legs buckled and he collapsed to his knees, the mask slipping from his hands and landing in the snow beside him. He stared at it, his chest heaving with sobs, his vision blurred with tears. He had been a fool. A pawn in a game he didn't even understand. The demon's curse had been so much more than a simple enchantment. It had been a weapon designed to destroy him from within, to make him doubt everyone and everything until there was nothing left but his own madness. And he had fallen for it. He had believed the mask's lies. Let it guide him down this path of blood and destruction. He was the monster. He had always been the monster. Jason's gaze fell to the mask, its hollow eyes staring back at him, empty and unfeeling. He felt the madness pulling at the edges of his mind, threatening to drag him under, to consume what little remained of his sanity. His thoughts were a whirlwind of pain, grief, and guilt. The faces of the people he had killed haunted him, their silent accusations burning into his soul. But there was one final horror left for him to face. The last vision, the one that had always eluded him, finally came into focus. He saw himself, standing alone in the town square, just as he was now, surrounded by death. But this time there were no demons. There was no battle, only him, kneeling in the snow, clutching the mask in his hands. And in his reflection he saw the truth, not as the mask had shown it to him, but as it truly was. The mask hadn't made him a hero. It hadn't revealed the hidden dangers of the world. It had made him into the very thing he feared most, a killer, a predator hunting those he had sworn to protect. The mask had been his prison, his curse, and in the end, it had consumed him. Jason dropped the mask, his hands trembling, his breath ragged in the frigid air. The weight of his actions crushed him, the memories of his victims screaming in his ears. He couldn't undo what he had done. He couldn't bring them back. The town was silent now. The people were gone, their lives taken by his hand. He had become the thing he had spent his life hunting, and there was no going back. Jason stood, his legs weak beneath him, the cold biting into his skin. He looked out over the empty streets, the snow falling softly around him. The mask lay at his feet, half buried in the snow, its presence still lingering like a shadow in his mind. He took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs, and for the first time in weeks, he felt a strange sense of peace. Not relief, not redemption. He knew there was no redemption for what he had done, but a quiet acceptance. He had seen the truth, and now there was only one thing left to do. Jason reached down, picked up the mask, and turned it over in his hands one last time. The whispers had stopped. The visions were gone. All that remained was the weight of his guilt and the knowledge that the nightmare was finally over. With slow, deliberate movements, he placed the mask on the ground, its hollow eyes staring up at the sky. He drew his blade, the cold steel gleaming in the moonlight, and with a single decisive strike, he drove the blade through the mask, shattering it into pieces. The echoes of the demon's curse faded into the night, leaving nothing but silence behind. Jason looked up at the sky, the snow falling in soft, quiet flakes, and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His hands, stained with the blood of the innocent, would never be clean again. But at least now he could stop. He could rest. As the cold closed in around him, Jason turned and walked away from the town, leaving the shattered remains of the mask and his own shattered soul buried in the snow behind him.